This summer, my dad and I went off to hike the Great Divide Trail in Alberta and British Columbia. This magical route traverses the Continental Divide, wandering through the vast wilderness of the Canadian Rocky Mountains for over 1,100 kilometers. Our goal was to complete the first 5 sections from Waterton to Jasper National Park, with over 850 total kilometers on trail. My dad had first heard of the hike almost 10 years ago while attending a Vancouver Mountain Film Festival documentary on the trail. I remember how intrigued yet scared he was after hearing of tales of swimming neck-deep river crossings and grizzly bear sightings. Fast forward to last summer, my dad, sister, and I got permits to hike the Rockwall Trail southbound in Kootenay National Park. This was our first time backpacking the Rockies, and it was truly a memorable experience. My dad, Steve, and I knew we wanted more from the Rockies, so on our return home, we began to plan our hike of the trail the following summer. After months of planning, including booking individual campsites for our 37 days on trail, the time came to leave what marked the end of the Continental Divide Trail. It was a remarkably hot 34 degrees Celsius, and we did not pass up the opportunity of a swim in Waterton Lakes before heading back to the car campground. From here on out is the story of our hike and the amazing views along the way. Please enjoy. Day 2 totaled 28 kilometers from Waterton to Roe Lake Meadows. We left town at 8 a.m. and arrived at campsite shortly before 8 p.m., a 12-hour day. Highlights included battling wind gusts as we approached the Alpine and looking at beautiful lakes on both sides of the peaks. We're making our way down from the top of the pass here. The wind has been insufferable, but it's beautiful out. All right, we are currently hiking up to Upper Roe Lakes. We've decided against camping in the burned out campground of Akamina Park. We saw a comment that there's like an old horse camp just by Upper Roe Lake, so we're on the way there. We're at about 26K for the day. I have another about 4 kilometers left to go, so good second day on the GDT. Day 3 was a short 12 kilometers to our reserved campsites at Lone Lakes. Today we met 2 other Great Divide Trail hikers, Rock Pocket and Guy on a Buffalo, also known as Tony and Michael. We actually started talking to them as they had noticed a large grizzly bear pretty close to our tent where we had slept the night before, and from there on we would hike most of the trail together. Day 4 was a stunning 28 kilometers to Scarp Pass. We made our way up and around a peak as we ascended out of Twin Lakes area. We also met a couple of locals who were doing a big 19-kilometer loop and headed to their bikes. We arrived at Jutland Creek, but after dinner decided to push on with the water carry up to Scarp Pass to be ready for the next day. We arrived at camp at 8 and were asleep by 9. Day 5 involved 26 kilometers finishing at Castle Mountain Ski Resort. We had originally intended to do the highly talked about Willowbee Ridge alternate, however we woke up this morning to dense cloud and rain. The dense cloud did help keep temperatures low, and we pushed on quickly, arriving to La Coulette Peak just after 9:30 in the morning. My dad and I's intention was to push on to the alternate, however, once we started navigating the wet rocks with poor visibility, we decided to push back to the peak and met up with Michael and Tony. From there, we dropped down through the easier conditions down to the logging road and eventually reached the resort. We were super ecstatic to see that the pub opened at 5, and we shared 2 great meals there with beer before falling asleep in Michael and Tony's awesome room that they had booked. Day 6 was a simple 29 kilometers. We had great weather, only a bit of road walking, and mostly ATV trails for the whole day. We pushed on past the provincial park campground and slept on a flat clearing on the top of Willowbee Ridge with beautiful evening views. Day 7 was downhill 22 kilometers into the town of Coleman. Wrapping up Section A, we had a ton of energy and were looking forward to a nice meal. The weather was great in the morning with some early afternoon showers, but we arrived at 2:30 where we were greeted by dawn at Country Encounters. After dropping our stuff off and showering, which was amazing, we headed over to the Rum Runners pub for a nice dinner before hitting the hay in the evening. Finishing Section A! Woo! The first day of Section B technically was our rest day, where we hiked 4 kilometers in the late evening just to get out of the town limits. The following day, we woke up early. However, I wasn't feeling great, and we stayed at camp until 11 a.m. From there, we made our way through uneventful trails for the first half of the day before getting up into the higher subalpine. As we traversed along peaks, we got great views of Crow's Nest Mountain before dropping through beautifully new-kept trails mixed in with logging roads. We finally made our way up to Window Mountain Lake, where I took a nice swim, and off we went to bed. We had a great day on day 10, walking 27 kilometers to the Links Road junction. It was a nice steep trail to get out of the bowl in the morning, but soon we found ourselves on awesome cut switchbacks up back into the Alpine. We caught some great rock wall views looking north before dropping back down into the camp for the evening. We met up with 2 who were section hiking a portion of B, Ruth and Evelyn. Dad also saw a fish while he was soaking his feet in the creek. I unfortunately had my minute rice for my buttered chicken not work out as planned, as it looks like the minute rice hadn't had enough time to dehydrate. Oh well. Day 11 involved 23 kilometers to North Hidden Creek. It was a great day for the most part. However, we did make a wrong turn, which involved us losing about an hour and a half of time uphill. However, on the way back down, I did find an old Alberta license plate that I would keep in my bag as a souvenir for the trip. We made our way into the beautiful valley of Dutch Creek and had lunch at the campground. From there, we began to start to smell smoke as we made our way up to the Tornado Pass and eventually the Tornado Saddle. However, getting over this Tornado Saddle still allowed us to see some beautiful views despite the smoke. As we dropped back down the opposite side, I saw what looked to be a fox run in front of me. We finally made it to North Hidden Creek campsite, which was beautiful and an old horse camp. We took a nice bath in the creek that ran through, and we watched the Big Lebowski before bed. It was a great day.
Tie your horse up.
Day 12 was 28 kilometers to the High Rock Campground, which was a pretty tough day. We got our first views of some pocket glaciers as we started off the day with a steep climb. We had a lunch at Beehive Pass and saw 5 bighorn sheep making their way up the steep shale. There were some beautiful views, but we were also quite tired halfway into Section B. We passed some mine relics before we finished the climb to camp. We set up and rolled into bed before the sky opened up with thunderstorms.
Day 13 was our biggest day on the trail. We were pretty motivated and we pushed a quick 6 kilometers in the morning before running into Charlene, a 2005 GDT thru hiker from Calgary. She recommended that instead of going to the planned James Lake at kilometer 31, we pushed on to a small random camp at the Upper Barrel Creek Pass. Once we passed through James Lake, we were still feeling energized, and so we pushed ahead after signing the register. It was a beautiful spot, but unfortunately 2 people were taking the main area, so we camped a bit on the slope as we listened to mice around us. It was a great day and our biggest day on trail yet.
Day 14 was a fantastic day. We made our way up to the top of the pass as we headed into BC and was greeted by some lovely meadows and easy walking. We then descended down an overgrown logging road where we met a bike packer who had been pushing his bike all the way up into the Alpine. He had done a loop from Coleman down to Elkford and was making his way back to his car. The next few hours were a bit frustrating as we made our way down through the steep and rugged logging road. We took a dip in Aldrich Creek where I scared a trout, and then we hid from the afternoon thunderstorms. From here on out, it was a road walk towards Elk Lakes Provincial Park. We had a great time in the evening as we passed a few horses on the loose that we named Geneva and Madeline.
Geneva!
We also met a drunk ATVer on the long weekend ripping up the road before we settled into a wreck site and finished the day at 31 kilometers. Day 15, we finished section 5 as we made our way into Peter Lougheed Provincial Park. The highlight of the day was watching an osprey catch a trout in the lower Elk Lakes before we made our way over to the trailhead and picked up our resupplies that Nicole had dropped off for us. After we made our way into camp, we then headed over to Bolton Creek Trading Post where we were greeted with pizza, hot dogs, and ice cream. On our way back to camp, we ran into a mama moose with 2 young babies, and it was a great way to finish Section B as we were looking forward to Section C. Instead of an extra day off, we decided to start Section C early, and we did the Northover Ridge alternate. The first day involved us hiking 12 kilometers to Astor Lakes. We had great views of a waterfall, made our way up loose shale, and arrived in the evening to Astor Lakes. There was only one camper there, and the rain started quickly after we set up our tents. It was a beautiful first day, and we were looking forward to the following day. The next day involved a 20-kilometer route to Beatty Lakes. We woke up early and unfortunately it was still raining. We waited around till 8 a.m. However, the rain didn't stop and we put on our rain gear and headed up through the Astor Lakes floodplains. The weather was very majestic but scary, and soon we were engulfed into a complete whiteout. We made our way high into the Alpine to 2,800 meters elevation, the highest we had been so far on the trail. There was no visibility and we had to stick 10 feet apart to see each other.
How's it going, Dad?
Great.
Woo! So we're on, headed our way up along Willowbee Ridge alternate. Excellent visibility.
This area was absolutely gorgeous, with glaciers all the way up to just below where we were walking. But without being able to see what was on either side, it was also quite frightening. Right at the end, the clouds parted and we got to see one of the best views of our life. Dad and I hugged and talked about how this was one of the best experiences we've ever had. After this, we made our way down to 3 Isle Lakes through another gorgeous floodplain where the rain started again and came down extremely heavy. It was very slippery, heading to Beatty Lakes, and we arrived in a complete torrential thunderstorm. We set up our tents, hung out in them for a few hours before the rain settled down, and at 6 p.m. we had dinner with Glenn and Scott, who were also hiking part of Section C. We chatted that night and went to bed. Unfortunately, during that night, my dad and Glenn had their stuff torn up by a fearless porcupine.
For day 18, we were expecting a pretty straightforward day. However, it turned out to be a really tough 22 kilometers to get to Birdwood Campground in Banff National Park. We left the morning at around 10:30 in the pouring rain and descended down with a pretty straightforward river crossing. We then followed the Palliser River Valley slowly and surely up to the Palliser Pass, where we saw a large female moose in the soaked area. Michael and Tony would later name the section the car wash, with how much water was on the dense bushes in this section. It was probably the most dense bushwhacking up to this point on the trail. We eventually reached Palliser Pass and entered Banff, where we made our way down into the beautiful valley as the clouds started to clear. We had a chance to eat lunch just before camp as we said bye to the guys, and we made our way to our campground. To our surprise, the campground allowed campfires, and we were able to have a beautiful campfire to ourselves as we cooked dinner and dried out my wet sleeping bag. That night, it got down below freezing, and we woke up to a bunch of ice on our tent. Day 19 was our longest day on trail at 42 kilometers, doing a marathon all the way to Porcupine Campground. It was one of the best days as well. We actually had reservations for Big Springs Campground in Banff, but we got there by 10 a.m. We then made our way to Wonder Pass by 1:30, where we stopped and had lunch and dried out our clothing as we dropped down into the Assiniboine Provincial Park. We were moving pretty quickly through Assiniboine as we started to see a bunch of people on the trail spending their time in one of BC's most popular provincial parks. We reached Og Lake by 6 p.m. and that's when things started to get tough as we pushed past kilometer 35. We finally made it to the tough descent down to the Porcupine Campground, where we got in at 8 p.m., which we were happy to see there were still quite a few tent pads left there. Day 20 was a straightforward 13 kilometers as we motored excited to Banff Sunshine Village. My mom had actually booked us a hotel for us when we were staying at Porcupine due to my sleeping bag getting soaking wet and me needing someplace to dry it out. We ascended through a steep trail from Porcupine up to the pass, but from there on it was pretty straightforward. I reached the pub by 12:30 and ordered chicken wings and a sandwich with a side Caesar. It was excellent, and my dad arrived about an hour later, grabbing the hotel room. After reloading on some extra food and having a nice breakfast in town, we headed back to the trail the easiest way possible on the chairlift. From there, we made our way down through beautiful but populated areas before finally getting away from the crowds. The trail passed through Banff National Park and Assiniboine Provincial Park as we walked along the divide. We stopped for a quick break at Healy Pass after crossing some beautiful streams with cutthroat trout in them. Then we made our way down to Egypt Lake and eventually up to Whistling Pass, where I took a detour down to the lovely Scarab Lake and took a swim. Back to the pass was a beautiful view looking northwest from us, where my dad would catch up as I listened to pika along the trail. We walked along Hyduke Lake, where we spotted a massive 16-inch trout swimming right beside us. We eventually got to camp at Ball Pass, which was a beautiful campsite with only one other party there, and we went to sleep pretty quickly. Day 22 was a simple 20 kilometers to Flow Lake, a trail that we were quite familiar with, having done the Rockwall Trail in reverse last year. We were assuming a big push up to get out of the campsite in the morning, but thankfully the mapping apps were wrong and it was only about 150 meters less elevation than we were expecting. Once we got to the other side, we started to see the wildfire that had ripped up the valley on both sides as we entered Kootenay National Park. We met two gentlemen coming up, but other than that, it was a very straightforward descent down as I ate wild raspberries and blueberries. I went ahead from my dad at this point and started the hike up to Flow Lake on a super hot and exposed day. The final last couple kilometers was very steep to get up to the lake, but it was rewarding as I arrived at around 2 p.m. Day 23 was 20 kilometers to the Wolverine Pass, approximately halfway along the Rockwall Trail. We were very happy to have split this day into 2 days, where some people push all the way from Ball Pass to Wolverine Pass in a single 40-kilometer day. As we were making our way up to the first pass of the day out of Flow Lake, we ran into Bryn and Holly, who were hiking southbound on the GDT. It was great to chat with them for a bit as we pushed on and wished them good luck. We then stopped at Numa Creek to fill up for some water before heading up to Tumbling Pass through the dense alders. This section was actually easier than I had expected despite how hot it was outside. At the top, I stopped and watched some shows myself and ate some lovely rice and beans. When we got closer to dropping down to Tumbling Creek, my dad and I stopped to check out the glaciers as we watched Step Brothers and hung out in the shade below some large larches. It was an awesome afternoon, and there was a fairly few people that we saw on the trail today. In the evening, we made our way over to Wolverine Pass, which was extremely windy, but we were able to set up our tents in a pretty good spot, and we fell asleep at around 9 p.m. Day 24 was a 30-kilometer day to a random camp along the logging road next to the Ottertail River. The smoke unfortunately had rolled in pretty dense this morning as we left camp and made our way to Helmet Falls. Once we got to Helmet Falls, we had decided that we actually wanted to go to the base of the falls, and we thankfully didn't get to see the resident grizzly bear. After this, we took a quick lunch and then made our way starting up to the Good Sir Pass, where my dad and I started to crack a bunch of jokes calling each other a bunch of good sirs. Then, as we started to push back down into the river valley, the trail got very smoky again as we traversed along the steep avalanche paths along the side. Day 25, we finished Section C, our longest section on the trail, with 15 kilometers to field. We mostly spent the day hiking along the highway. Other than that, it was fairly uneventful, and we were happy to get into field at around 11 a.m. and pick up our resupply box, where we got new shoes and new socks.
We did 26 kilometers on day 26, which was a fun surprise. The morning started climbing 1,000 meters up dense switchbacks as we got into the Alpine in Yoho National Park. A highlight was seeing over 75 mountain goats traversing below Burgess Shale Rock before making our way to Yoho Lake. Then we headed on to the Iceline Trail where the heavy wind and steep, strong rain started smashing down on us. We could barely see after 30 minutes and got absolutely drenched. We lucked out by getting a spot at the Alpine Club of Canada hut as a group had showed up and let us dry off inside. We shared stories with a bunch of other folks that had similar experiences in the tough weather before leaving at around 6 p.m. to get to camp. Unfortunately, it started to snow shortly afterwards and we got soaked again as it snowed a few inches in an hour. We fell asleep cold but mostly dry. Day 27 was a big 33 kilometers to Collie Creek Camp. On the second day of the Kootenay alternate, we woke up to beautiful sunshine and a few inches of snow. Thankfully, the snow melted pretty quick, but the ice in the rocks was a major concern going down Kootenay Pass. Unfortunately, I snapped my carbon fiber hiking pole and I was down to one hiking pole from here on out. We got up to the Kootenay Gap, which was much easier than expected, and the bushwhacking down to the Nisqually logging road was relatively straightforward. After a nice break, resting and drying out our clothes, we pushed on through some of the best black huckleberry bushes of our lives. The black huckleberries were so rich and we ate them and the blueberries for hours. At around 8 p.m., just as the sun was setting, we decided to do the new Ensign alternate, followed by the Collie Creek alternate. We arrived at our camp along Collie Creek at approximately 11:30 p.m. after a big long day, and we fell asleep with beautiful stars. After a big push the day before, day 28 was a straightforward 24 kilometers to the House floodplain. We hiked the rest of the 4 kilometers on the alternate and were happy to see the Blueberry River Bridge was still in. I saw a large bull trout in the river as we made our way up, and we reached House Pass and learned how it linked the North Saskatchewan and the Columbian River. We then descended down to the floodplains on a bit rougher trails now that we had entered northern sections of Banff National Park, where the GDTA had limited options of maintaining the trail. We stopped and had dinner at 6, and then we pushed onwards to camp, taking a slow approach. This area was gorgeous as the sun was setting right over the river, and we finally stopped and set up camp right before a creek crossing. We crawled into bed and fell right asleep to the sound of the nearby water. Day 29 was 26 kilometers, ending Section D at the Saskatchewan River Resort. We got up at 7 a.m. and the first thing we had to do was cross the creek. We had heard quite a few scary stories of this section of rough bushwhacking, but thankfully it was pretty straightforward. The route finding was fun as we navigated the floodplains, crossing through knee to thigh deep water, but nothing was too sketchy. The juniper ripped our pants up pretty good, but our shins stayed totally fine. Eventually, we hit civilization again, and then it was a 4.5 kilometer road walk on the shoulder of the highway to the crossing resort. Thankfully, they still had some rooms left, and we decided we were going to take our first proper 0 day of the trip, and we booked 2 nights here. Our room was great, and we lucked out getting some Wi-Fi from the nearby pub as we caught up with friends and family. Day 31 was the start of Section E, and we went 17 kilometers to Michelle Lakes. We made our way from Saskatchewan Crossing at 11:30 back to the North Saskatchewan River, where we followed an old logging road trail that ran parallel to it. We then got to the Owen Creek trailhead and made our way starting up the rough ascent towards the pass. We then made our way to Owen Creek Trailhead and started the ascent up to the steep pass. Unfortunately, on the way up, my second carbon fiber hiking pole snapped on me as I navigated some wet logs. With 2 broken poles, I was pretty chapped, but I was able to find a nice walking stick and used it on the way up. When we got into the Alpine, I saw some massive bighorn sheep, which was excellent to see super close to me as the wind started gushing. We dropped down to Michelle Lakes, and I was able to set up tent with my dad arriving a few hours later. It was a very windy night, but thankfully it all saved. But thankfully, my tent stayed up. Day 32 was a simple 14-kilometer push to Pinto Lake North. We reached the official high point of the GDT as we climbed out of the Michelle Lakes Basin up to the pass.
We're at the highest point of the Great Divide Trail. About 2,600 meters. Absolutely beautiful. It's about 5 degrees Celsius right now. Really cold wind chill. And we're just so excited. We did get up to 2,800 meters on the Northover Ridge alternate, but for the official GDT, this is the highest point. Woo!
It was clear and not raining, but still we didn't have the best views as there was some residual fog and smoke. We dropped down the far side, making our way down before going back up again. On the way down to Pinto Lake, I ran into another GDT hiker, Pitbull, who was actually completing the last part of his full GDT hike that he had skipped earlier in the summer. He mentioned he had a bottle of champagne in his backpack, which was pretty exciting. We eventually got to Pinto Lakes, where there was a few other campers there, but by the end of the night there was over 14 separate campers there, one of the busiest parts of the trail. It was really cool to catch up with everyone and share different stories, and we went to bed quite late. Hands down, day 33 was the best day on trail. We hiked 27 kilometers to Boulder Campground, and my dad also turned 62 today. The views just gradually got better and better as we were presented with some great weather after a couple overcast days. As we started to make our way up the Cataract River Valley, we saw views looking northwest, and eventually we got into the grass meadows below Cataract Pass. Once we got to the top of Cataract Pass, the views just got even better as we were greeted with the headwaters of the Brazeau River Valley, and we officially stepped foot into Jasper National Park. Dropping down, we were able to walk right past 20 to 30 bighorn sheep grazing in the valley and past rocks the size of homes. Unfortunately, Boulder Campground was not the best. It had pretty uneven tent pads, but we still found a lot of happiness in having a great day, and we fell asleep with a smile on our face. It would be another 30 kilometers on day 34 as we pushed to Waterfall Campground in Jasper. We left camp fairly early and passed some hikers leaving in camp as they were doing the Brazo River Loop. We then turned off towards Jonas Pass, which was a nice and gentle climb with over 10 kilometers in an exposed but beautiful valley. A gentle breeze kept me cool as I walked and made my way up to the high point. There I would see Jane, Roy, and Tasman having lunch under the only tree, and I set up just past them for an hour and dried out my clothes before having lunch. As I ate my meagering, I chatted with a few hikers from New Zealand and the UK before my dad would eventually catch up to me. We headed out together and started the climb up to Jonas Shoulder, which at this point I realized I had too much sun exposure and I took a long break as my dad pushed on from the top. It was a slow and steady descent all the way to the camp where I met up with my dad and we got the first picking of the tent spots. 2 big picnic tables with a view of the large waterfalls was an excellent place for dinner, and we hung out and spent our last night with Jane and Co. Day 35 was a 39-kilometer day to Trapper Creek Campground. We knew we had a big day ahead of us, but thankfully not much elevation. The start of the day was mostly flat with a slow descent to the Malign Pass trailhead. From there, we met a day hiker and we took turns leading the push back up into the Alpine. We said bye once we passed Avalanche Campground, and I stopped for a nice swim at the lake feeding the river south and northbound. Here, we were prepared for some bad bushwhacking as we were reading on the Far Out app, but it was no issues at all to get to our campground of Maryvaux and eventually Mary Schaefer, where we had a reservation. We were feeling extra good at this point, and we made the mutual decision to push on another 10 kilometers to Trapper Creek. The willows were excessively dense as we left camp and then waded across a river before another painful few kilometers of dense bushwhacking. Thankfully, it ended and it was a calm 5-kilometer walk as we got to camp just before sunset. A group of canoers were there and they had an extra camp spot, so Dad and I were in luck. We tied our ursacks to the tree and went to bed. Day 36 was a simple 10 kilometers to Evelyn Creek Campground. A big reason for the push that the day before was that we heard there was a cafe at Malign Lake, so we got up and made our way over. It was quite touristy and the food was subpar, but thankfully it was a nice rest and we filled up on sweets. Later in the day, we made our way along the start of the Skyline Trail to the lovely Mona Lake. We were greeted by a deer and saw some fish jumping. It was a nice and easy day where we made our way to the Evelyn Creek Campground before the finish of the trail. Our last day on the Great Divide Trail, day 37, was a 51-kilometer push to the town of Jasper. We got up early at 6 a.m. and started to climb the first pass of the day, Little Shovel. From here, we dropped down and passed the busy Snowbolt campground as the campers were starting to pack up. At Big Shovel Pass, I met a few Great Divide Trail section hikers on day 2 of a southbound hike from Jasper to Banff Sunshine Village. I wished them luck and pushed onwards to Curator Lake. I had a lovely swim as my dad got a head start up the tough climb to the notch. The views at the top were great, but even better as I climbed the peak to the west. From here on out, Dad and I got cell service and we decided to make a push to skip our campground that night at Signal. When we eventually got there, we were excited we made that call as it was pretty bad. The final 20 kilometers involved some annoying Forest Service road walking downhill, but we stayed motivated. We finally arrived in Jasper just before 8 p.m., and we were thrilled to say the least as we had finished our summer on the Great Divide Trail. We took showers at the laundromat before eating Neapolitan pizza and wings with some local beer at the pizza store. Over the next 36 hours, we started the slow return back home to Vancouver. We took a bus to Calgary the following day before sleeping the night. We would then drive 11 hours back home. It wasn't until I was nearing home that it hit me. I had just spent the better part of 6 weeks with my dad doing the trip of a lifetime. We laughed, fought, cried, and cheered for 37 days together. We ate garbage food to maximize calories, and still I managed to lose 25 pounds. But all in all, it will go down as one of my fondest summers. If you made it to this point, I'd like to say thank you, and please consider hiking this incredible trail one day if you can. You will not be disappointed.